Hi, my name is Tom Dirsa, and I was fortunate a few years ago to work with the Leduc Public Library to develop a new history book about Leduc. It's called Leduc Then and Now. It was 63 years since the last history book was published. Now the proceeds of the book is going to the Leduc Public Library, and it is available at the library. You can see a stand like this at the information desk. Currently, we're working on a second Leduc history book due to the increased questions I had about the early history of Leduc. What led us to write this second book is our curiosity about the individuals that made an impact on Leduc's early development. Where did they come from? Why did they come? And what happened to them? Did they remain in Leduc or did they move on? Today we'd like to present 3 stories that we're working on for the new book. The first is a story of 2 men who were responsible for Leduc getting its name. Who were they? What brought them to the stagecoach line south of Edmonton at the same time? The second story is about those men who established Leduc's educational system and the expectation of excellence. And the final story is about a man who came to Leduc at the beginning of the 1900s, and by 1913 was Leduc's MLA. His story is a story of how Leduc has often led the way for others to follow. In 1875, the federal government decided that there was a need for a telegraph line to go from Winnipeg to the west. It was to accompany the development of the Northwest Mounted Police. The communication system was imperative. The line went from Winnipeg to Calgary, but the second line was to go from Winnipeg to northern Alberta. It was not to include the city of Edmonton at that time. It was to follow Stanford Fleming's survey line for a railroad. It did not cross the Saskatchewan River. It was to go through Grizzly Bear Coulee, the Hay Lakes, north to the area which would become known as Leduc, and from there go west. Fort Edmonton, the Hudson Bay Company, and the settlers that were there raised money to have the line extended into Edmonton itself. The line was poorly constructed. The line went through swampland. Buffalo would often rub their shoulders on the poles, knocking them down. The line was more often off than on. In 1885, the Northwest Rebellion caused the government to re-examine the telegraph line, and therefore 2 were going to be built once again. One would go from Calgary to Edmonton. The second would go from the Battlefords to Edmonton through Fort Saskatchewan. In 1885, the rebellion had caused an uproar and communication had become critical. Now enter 2 men. Both were born in the 1840s. A man by the name of Malcolm McKinley was born in 1848, and the Reverend Father Lacombe was born in 1842. And what brought them to Alberta? Father Leduc came to Alberta as a missionary, working under Father Lacombe. He headquartered himself in St. Albert and spent much of his time throughout the northern Alberta establishing missions. Malcolm McKinley was born in Prince Edward Island and he became a teacher. And when the Prince Edward Island decided to build a railroad, he got involved and became a station manager at one of their outposts in 1871. But the railroad was overexpensive. PEI decided to join the Confederation, and part of the deal was that the Confederation would take over the running of the railroad. When the federal government looked at it, they said there's too many stations. They began to cut it back, and Malcolm lost his position as a railroad manager. and operator of a telegraph office. Currently, a couple of years later, he returned to farming, and a couple of years later, his wife died. He continued to work as a teacher and helped with the family farm, but his older brethren had gone out west and wrote back to Malcolm that the opportunity for him was out in the west. His brother actually had come into Fort Edmonton and developed the first sawmill for the area. Malcolm decided to come west. He arrived in the area just around the St. Albert area, established a homestead pretty close to the location where Hole's Gardens are now located. 1885 comes around and the government asks him to take his skills as a telephone operator and use it during the war. After the war, the telegraph companies were upgrading the lines, and they asked him to stay on as a repairman and as an operator. In 1886, he's operating in the Edmonton area, south of Edmonton in Leduc, or what was to be known as Leduc. He establishes a repeating station, and he's given the orders to name the station. Now, coincidence, a second event is occurring. Father Leduc in St. Albert has a group of farmers that are upset about the new survey. The new survey, the federal government has insisted to use the English system of acres. The people that lived in that area were mostly French heritage, and they wanted the Quebec system that allowed land to be developed from a water source as a river or a lake. And there was a discussion. The discussion resolved in a committee of two. They were to go to Ottawa, plead their case, and they were on and set their way in early April. Father Leduc wanted to contact the bishop in Ottawa to let him know they were on their way. The station in St. Albert was down. The station in Edmonton was down. So they got on the stagecoach. A few miles south of Edmonton, they came across a brand new repeating station that had not yet been opened. The Edmonton Bulletin in June 5th reports that a repeating station in the south of Edmonton was to be named Leduc. So what happened is Father Lacombe went in to send a telegraph to the bishop that they were on their way to Ottawa. This occurred in April of 1886. Long story short, he got on the stagecoach, continued to Calgary, went to Ottawa, and in November they came back with a success. The government had agreed to use the same system that they wanted for the St. Albert area. And coincidentally enough, November was the same month when the Leduc station became official. Now, what happened to those two men after their meeting in April is also an interesting story. Father Leduc continued his missionary work, and as part of his work, he went to Winnipeg to convince the Northwest Territory of developing a two-tiered educational system. Father Leduc is primarily responsible for the separate school system that exists in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And I think it's very appropriate that the city of Leduc and the school division, St. Thomas Aquinas, has named their latest school the Father Leduc School. Malcolm is a different story. Malcolm continued to work in the St. Albert area. He helped his sons develop their homestead in the Spruce Grove area. And he also worked again with Father Leduc when they were developing a force to be reckoned with regarding farmers and strengthening their voice in terms of crop and how much money they would be made. Malcolm continued to homestead, like as I said, near the Hole's Garden area. And In 1899, Malcolm met a young woman, actually not that young, she was in her 50s, that had just come up from South Dakota. She established a homestead nearby his homestead. Her husband had died in a tragic railroad accident, and she had remarried. The new husband acquired her homestead that she had developed from the insurance of her husband. And when they divorced, he got her homestead and she got his homestead, which was undeveloped. She sold it and migrated to northern Alberta, where she met McKinley. They were married, and they continued to work together in the homestead. McKinley taught, he sat on school boards, he was quite an active individual. His youngest son, Murdoch, served in the Boer War, but by 1929, at the age of 87, totally blind, McKinley died. Father Leduc may have chuckled on his return from Ottawa, seeing this lonely shack in the middle of nowhere with his name on it. 5 years later, his name would become permanent for the name of a hamlet that had grown alongside the telegraph and a new railroad station. McKinley's encounter with Father Leduc did not end with a chance meeting at a remote telegraph repeating station. He would join Father Leduc in 1894 in support of a development of the St. Albert Patrons of Industrial Association, which goal was to provide farmers a voice in the provincial and federal levels to support rural concerns and needs. Father Leduc oversaw the construction of the St. Benedict's Catholic Church in 1896. At the time, many of the residents continued to call their hamlet as Telford Place. But when the hamlet became a village in 1899, Leduc's name had totally replaced Telford's. Leduc would live a long life and became a strong voice for Catholic education. His influence was felt when Saskatchewan and Alberta became provinces, as the federal government would recognize a separate school system along with the public education system. He died at the age of 76 on June 29, 1918, with his remains being placed in a crypt located in St. Albert. These two men left their imprint on the history of Leduc. McKinley was a skilled farmer and educator. He used his skill as a telegrapher to support his family, and that skill would bring him to a repair station just south of Edmonton. At the same time, one of Alberta's leading missionaries was on his way to Ottawa. This chance meeting resulted in Father Leduc's name being immortalized. A Grateful City paid tribute to McKinley when they named a park in South Fork after him. The second story is about the foundation of Leduc's educational system. And there are three men that we'll mention. Two played important roles in the development. And once again, what happened to them after they did what they did for Leduc? The first was William Douglas. William Douglas was born in 1851 in Quebec. He came out west to help his uncle homestead in the Red Deer area in 1879. He had become a teacher. And the remarkable thing about William Douglas is that he had suffered from polio, and the disease had left him a cripple with barely the use of one arm. He found out that homesteading was not his cup of tea. So in 1891, he headed north to the Strathcona area, where he took up teaching once again. He taught for a year in the Strathcona area before being drawn to an area just south of Edmonton, an area that was called Telford Place, but other people called it Leduc. He established a store with his teaching partner. It was to be the first hardware store in the area. Unfortunately, by 1893, the store was in the middle of an economic depression, the Panic of 1893, and his partner left him. Robert Telford saw the need for such a store and decided to partner with Douglas. And Douglas brought up his niece and his nephew to help him. Douglas also had a skill as an educator, and when the people of Leduc found out that he had the ability to draw up the papers to send to the Northwest government for a school, they asked him to file the papers for them. He did it for Leduc and for Sunnydale, an area just east of Leduc. Papers came in. The problem was that he had to have 6 students to have an official school. So 6 students were found, but there was no school. So Douglas set up a little place in his store and began to teach the students. Then the school was built, a 2-room school located very close to where the public library now exists. First teacher was a gentleman by the name of D.J. Matheson. He had come from British Columbia, and the Edmonton Bulletin reported that the public school is now in full swing under the able management of D.J. Matheson from Denver. What happened to Mr. Matheson, we don't know, because by the end of the year, Douglas was back in the classroom. However, when the mud season came, Douglas found it extremely difficult to maneuver his crutches from his store to the new school. So the look for a new teacher was on. At that time, the railroad was dropping off new homesteaders almost on a daily basis. On one of the trains, escorting farm implement equipment, a man by the name of John Morin and his son, Will, stepped off the train. John had an interesting background. He had been a school inspector in Ontario, but when the school division combined his job with another job, he found himself out of work, so he headed west. He headed for Kansas and to Homestead. His wife and his children settled in an area in western Kansas. She started to run the homestead, and John got a job as a teacher. As their children were growing up, John was highly thought of as a great teacher, highly respected. But then 1895 comes around, and the drought in Kansas is severe. It had started in 1890, and by 1895, people were leaving Kansas, a lot of them heading north to Alberta. John had a friend who suggested that maybe John should look for his future up north. John came up, checked the area out, thought it was nice, but he still had his teaching job. But then he got back to Kansas, found out that his school was being closed and the opportunities for continuing as an educator had diminished to 0. John decided perhaps Alberta was the place to go. So at that time, his friend was packing up, and John offered to accompany the equipment in the baggage to save on train fare. Along with his son, he arrived in Leduc in 1895 and was immediately hired as the teacher for Leduc. He's gone down in the history books, at least the local history book, as Leduc's first teacher. And I can say he was our first full-time teacher that survived an entire school year. When John arrived in Leduc, he was 52 years old. He had a wealth of teaching experience. He was a big man and quite knowledgeable. In the book From Frontier Days in Leduc and District on page 118, he is described as a portly, somewhat pompous, who didn't live like a gentleman and a scholar. He had the bearing of a professor and the size to instill respect and some learning into the minds of the district youthful hopefuls. John, at the end of the year, left and moved into the Fort Saskatchewan area and became a teacher at St. Joseph's for many, many years. He returned to farming, was fairly successful as a farmer, and when his wife found that their farm in Kansas was no longer profitable, she came up north and joined him with his 2 young daughters. His wife did not take well to the frontier life, and she returned to Ottawa with the 2 girls. John continued with his son and became quite well known in the Fort Saskatchewan, St. Joseph's area. And as he reached retirement age, he got involved with a group of people called the Society of Equity. They were trying to reduce costs for farmers. The first thing that they did was they got baling twine at a reduced cost. They invested in some lumber mills and began to construct elevators. The Sons of Equality would eventually, and he became president of the society, but the following year, the Sons joined with a group of farmers that eventually became known as the United Farmers of Alberta. John continued to work with them for a number of years and finally retired. And when he retired, he went to Florida. And he bought a powerboat and he named it Alberta. What happened to John after that is lost in the fog of history. But he did establish the excellence that the Leduc school systems have followed ever since. Hi, the third person I'd like to talk to you about is Stanley G. Tobin. Now, Stanley came to Leduc around 1900. He was part of the Bachelors Club that set up in the Waldorf Hotel. The Waldorf Hotel was a place where the bachelors of the area that were not currently engaged in anything else but doing the business of the area lived. They formed a number of clubs. Baseball and hockey were 2 of them. And Stanley played on both the hockey and the baseball team. He and his partner Featherstone developed an implement dealership that eventually would go in to become a car dealership down the road, an insurance agency. And they also got involved in auctioning. By 1903, Stanley began to get involved in town politics. He was actively supportive of the Board of Trade, or as it was called at that time, now the Chamber of Commerce. He was actively involved in some service clubs that were just in the formation, such as the Masons. By 1913, he had become the Secretary-Treasurer for the hamlet of the town of Leduc. But also in 1913, there was an opportunity to run for the member of the legislature for Leduc in the Alberta provincial government. Tobin decided to run for the MLA position against Robert Telford. In the Liberal caucus, Tobin won over Telford and became the candidate for the Liberals. And surprisingly enough, the Liberals represented Leduc for the first 20-odd years of Alberta's existence. Tobin won the Liberal caucus and then won the general election. One of the first things he did was to start working for women's rights. It is reported in the Edmonton Bulletin that Telford totally supported Tobin. In fact, he is quoted as saying he would take off his coat and work as hard as any man in the consistency on behalf of Mr. Tobin. His main opponent in 1913 was a conservative called George Curry. Tobin proved to be an extraordinary and articulate speaker who championed farmers' concerns and women's suffrage. In 1916, his speech was reported as, "It is the most gratifying that a Western Canada is a vanguard of progress in giving women a citizenship in every regard on an equal basis of that of a man. That women in the past did not share equal franchise with a man is the result of clinging to primitive ideas." 1917, he made a request for Leduc to be on the site of an agricultural school, stating that Leduc was one of the oldest and best settled constituencies in the province, that his people were essentially agricultural, and that they were anxious to better their children and themselves in the pursuit of their calling. Unfortunately, throughout the years, Leduc has attempted to have a college in Leduc, and it has yet to be realized. Tobin continued to speak for women's suffrage, freight rates for farmers, and the building of a railroad to the western sections of his riding. The Calgary Albertan reported that Stanley G. Tobin of Leduc is one of the most valuable members of the House, made what is regarded as the ideal speech by a member of the opposition. It was moderate, clear, and well delivered. It gave praise where praise was due. It was quite free from bitterness or any kind of animosity. It criticized where criticism was needed. It was in every respect a fine example to the House. Year in and year out, he has been devoting his attention and energy to get a railroad extension to the west of his riding. Unfortunately, it would not be until 1931 when the Leduc Northwest Railroad would be completed, coming through Leduc. In 1919, Tobin sold his interest in his business, and in December, the family decided to take a vacation to California. He did this while the legislation was in recess, but then he was called by the premier to return as the session was going to resume. He and his family, his wife and his son, got on a train and headed back for Leduc. By the time they reached Spokane, they had all become sick. The Spanish flu's second wave had hit the family. And while in Spokane, his wife died. He returned a widow, but immediately appeared at the legislation. A few years later, he met the first lady lawyer of Alberta, working for the Attorney General, and it was love at first sight. By 1922, they were married. They would have 2 children, a boy and a daughter. Coincidentally enough, the daughter is still alive. In my first book, The Leduc Then Now, I made the error of confusing Dorothy Gordon Stanley with the Dorothy Gordon of Tobin's marriage. She did not go to Chicago, and her son did not become a famous architect for Chicago. what she did is she became a mother, and at 95 is still alive, living in Toronto. She's a ballerina. In 2017, she performed in a major ballerina festival in Montreal. And she continues to keep me updated on the latest goings with her family. His wife, Greta Plater, as I said, became Alberta's first lady lawyer, and then became the first lady lawyer to work for the Attorney General. In 1925, Tobin decided that he wanted to run to represent Alberta at the federal government level. And he ran against the current incumbent and defeated him, and became the only MLA from Leduc to become an MP for Alberta. Unfortunately, he didn't stay there very long. It was a time of slander and scandal. The Mackenzie government fell to the Conservatives. The Conservative actually didn't have an election, so he continued to serve, but on the third day of the new government, unfortunately the new Conservative government fell 3 days later to a no confidence vote, and a new election was on. In the new election, Tobin was defeated by a United Farmers of Alberta candidate. And his reign, or his time as a legislator, had come to an end. During his short, brief time as an MP, he had made some associations with some of the mining companies in the area, and Tobin would spend the rest of his life as an executive for mining companies. He would die in 1948 at the age of 77. His son would continue and died a few years after, 20 years later. Tobin was perhaps the least known of our political leaders, but probably the most successful. Now, we have other stories that we would like to tell you. If you're interested, let the library know, and we will come back and do another session. We're hoping to have our book out at Christmas time this year, and the details that we've gone over are more fully disclosed in the book. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great day, and stay safe.